has on any given person. Philip Zimbardo began to set up the experiment, and then it started to collapse once the guards became too violent with the inmates. Zimbardo realized from this experiment that power can affect any person negatively, and it doesn't end up well. In the beginning of the experiment, a psychologist from Stanford University, Philip Zimbardo, got together with colleagues from the university and set up the experiment. It was planned to be 14 days long, and he was going to have 12 inmates and 12 guards. They were going to be paid $15 a day to participate, and he got hundreds of applicants in the newspaper that he put out, and he had to rule out multiple of them and got down to 24 people, obviously. According to Saul McLeod, who wrote the article Stanford Prison Experiment, people were picked up from their homes, driven in police cars to get fingerprinted and booked. The criminals were given assigned a crime like anybody else. It was randomly assigned, and that was their role as inmates. Zimbardo wanted the experiment to be as realistic as humanly possible, and so the guards took on their role as they should. Now that I've explained how they set up the experiment, I'll begin to talk about what exactly happened. Once the inmates were completely processed, the guards took control of the inmates. According to prisonexperiment.org, a website that wrote the article with the story and overview of the experiment, the guards were given full control of what to do with the inmates. They were told to enforce the law, but wasn't really told what the law specifically was. Guards became aggressive and began to abuse the inmates and humiliate them. According to Christopher Zukas, who wrote the article, What Humanity Learned at the Stanford Prison Experiment, a prisoner wrote, "I was 416. I was really my number." This quote shows that the prison experiment really began to make the inmates a shell of themselves and broke down the humanity of those inmates. The guards each day they got increasingly violent, and they would spray them with fire extinguishers. They would make them strip naked in front of their peers to humiliate them. They would make them get up in the middle of the night and strip naked in front of their peers. Now we can finally talk about the results of the experiment. After 6 days of the experiment, Zimbardo realized that he needed to shut it down because it began to get out of control. Prisoners wanted to leave, but they obviously weren't allowed to because they agreed to this. According to CBS News, who wrote the article Shocking Prison, 40 Years Later, What Really Happened at Stanford, parents began to call Zimbardo asking how to get their sons out of it and if they needed to hire lawyers in order to how to get their sons out of the prison, and that was when Zimbardo realized he needed to end the experiment earlier. Everyone became someone that they didn't recognize at the beginning of the experiment. The inmates were a shell of themselves. The guards were just a symbol of power, and even Zimbardo began to become someone he didn't know. According to Elizabeth Hopper, who wrote the article Biography of Philip Zimbardo, Zimbardo began to not recognize himself as he took on the role as prison superintendent. Obviously, he was watching over the prison, making sure everything was running how it should. Finally, Philip Zimbardo in the beginning gathered volunteers for the prison experiment, and it began to quickly unravel as the guards began to become too violent, and he had to shut it down at the end as he learned a lot of things from the experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment was planned to show what people learn from power and the effects that it has on someone, and it did just that. People have written movies, episodes, books, psychology. This is one of the biggest experiments in psychology, and people have learned a lot from this experiment and will forever be relevant to the lives that we live.